On the evening of August 31st, 1939, in a small border town called Gleiwitz, a German radio station went on the air with a message in Polish. It was short, it was angry. And it was exactly the kind of thing Adolf Hitler needed to hear in public, because by that point he had already decided what would happen at dawn. The men who delivered that broadcast were not Polish soldiers. They were SS operatives in stolen uniforms, running a staged attack that would later be folded into German propaganda as proof that Poland had fired first. The next morning, Hitler would stand in Berlin and tell the Reichstag, "This night, for the first time, Polish regular soldiers fired on our territory. Since 5:45 a.m., we have been returning the fire." That line is one of the most famous lies of the 20th century, not because it fooled everyone, but because it was never meant to. It was meant to do two things at once: give Germans a simple story and give diplomats something to argue about while German panzers were already crossing the frontier. And here's the part most people miss. Hitler did not start World War II because he wanted a war with Britain in September of 1939. He started it because he believed he could get what he wanted in Poland without triggering the kind of response that would actually stop him. He had reasons for that belief. He had evidence in his mind that Britain would bark and then step aside. He had watched it happen again and again. He had watched Britain accept Germany rearming. He had watched the Rhineland. He had watched Austria. He had watched Munich. He had watched the Sudetenland. And then, most important of all, he had watched March 1939, when he destroyed what was left of Czechoslovakia after Munich and still did not face war. So when the moment came to move on Poland, Hitler did what gamblers do. He looked at the previous hands and convinced himself the next card would come up the same way. But Britain did not play the same hand this time. Britain had backed itself into a corner. Britain had drawn a line around Poland's independence. And once you draw a public line like that, your enemy gets to decide whether it's real. Hitler decided it wasn't. The story of why he made that decision is not one simple motive like Danzig or the corridor, and it isn't a single conversation or a single document. It's a chain of misread signals, deliberate bluffing, ideological obsession, strategic fear, and one brutal reality. Hitler's entire project depended on expansion to the east, and Poland was standing in the doorway. To understand why Hitler started the war with Poland, you have to start months earlier, not at dawn on September 1st, but in spring 1939, when the last illusions about limited revision began to die. In March 1939, Hitler finished what Munich had started. Germany moved into the rest of Czechoslovakia and dismantled it. This mattered for Poland, but it mattered even more for Britain, because it proved something that many in London had tried not to see. Hitler did not treat agreements as boundaries. He treated them as tools. For years, British leaders had hoped that concessions could buy time for rearmament, time for diplomacy, time for a settlement that would satisfy Germany without another catastrophe. But after Prague fell, that hope stopped being policy and started being delusion. Within weeks, Britain did something it had avoided for most of the 1930s. It committed itself publicly to the fate of a country in Eastern Europe. On March 31st, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain told the House of Commons that if Poland's independence was clearly threatened and Poland resisted, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power. That sentence sounds cautious, legalistic, and conditional, the way British statements often did. But its effect was simple. It was a warning to Berlin. If you move on Poland, you may get war with Britain. Hitler heard it. He also discounted it. He discounted it partly because he wanted to, and partly because of the people around him. His foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, had built his career on the belief that Britain was weak, decadent, and allergic to war. He had spent years selling Hitler a picture of Britain as a bluffing empire, a nation that would negotiate, protest, and ultimately yield rather than bleed for a quarrel in a faraway country. And Hitler himself had a psychological record of success that reinforced the same conclusion. Every time he had escalated, Britain had stepped back. The pattern had trained him, but spring 1939 also changed something inside Hitler's timetable. He had always wanted Poland, he had always wanted the East, but now he believed time was tightening. Germany's rearmament was enormous, but so was the rearmament of the powers he feared. Every year that passed gave Britain and France more aircraft, more tanks, more organization, more readiness to fight, and Hitler's entire approach depended on fighting enemies one by one, not together. So in May 1939, he told his military leadership in blunt terms that Poland was no longer a question of negotiation. Poland would be attacked, and the risk of a wider war was part of the calculation. The record of Hitler's May 23, 1939 conference with senior commanders includes him speaking about living space and making clear that this is impossible without invasion of foreign states. This is the point where Poland stops being a bargaining chip and becomes an objective. If you're looking for the moment the war becomes structurally likely, it's here. Poland mattered to Hitler for ideology, strategy, and geography at the same time. Ideology first. Hitler's worldview was built on the belief that Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, in the East. Not trade, not colonies overseas, land, soil, grain, resources, and the removal, subjugation, or elimination of the people living on it. Poland was not just a state in the way. Poland was a population and a territory Hitler believed should not exist in its current form. Strategy second. Germany had a nightmare from World War I, a two-front war, West and East. Hitler was determined never to repeat it. But you cannot attack eastward into a space where France and Britain might attack you from the west unless you believe one of two things. Either they will not fight, or you can neutralize the East quickly and then turn. That is why Poland was so important. A swift, nonviolent campaign in Poland would do two things at once. It would remove the immediate barrier to German expansion, and it would test whether Britain and France would actually go to war when confronted with an invasion they had promised to resist. Geography third. Between Germany and East Prussia lay the Polish corridor. The free city of Danzig sat on the Baltic coast with a mostly German population, but under international arrangements from Versailles. Hitler made demands around Danzig and corridor access in 1939, including the annexation of Danzig and extraterritorial transit. These issues were real, but in Hitler's mind, they were also useful because they could be presented as reasonable revisions to outsiders who still wanted to believe there was a limit to German ambition. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum describes Hitler's demand for Danzig's annexation and access across the corridor in preparation for war with Poland. So Hitler was building a narrative. Germans in Danzig, German rights, German access, German humiliation. It sounded like a continuation of earlier crises. It was not. It was a setup. Poland understood that too, and it refused to turn itself into a corridor state at Germany's mercy. Poland had seen what happened to Czechoslovakia after concessions. It knew that one more demand never ended. In the months that followed, the diplomacy looked like negotiation, but the machinery underneath was already moving toward war. Plans were being drawn, timetables discussed, troops positioned, public lines drawn and redrawn. Then came the hinge event of August 1939, the pact that removed Hitler's greatest fear. For years, Nazi ideology had presented Bolshevism as a mortal enemy. Hitler had ranted about it, promised war against it, built his identity around destroying it. And yet, on August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. More importantly, they signed secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The Avalon Project preserves the text of the secret additional protocol, including the line that the spheres of influence in Poland would be bounded roughly by the rivers Nerv, Vistula, and San. That document meant Hitler could attack Poland without immediately triggering a Soviet intervention against him. It reduced the two-front risk. It also promised that if Poland fought and survived in the East, the Soviet Union could crush it from behind. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that the German-Soviet pact paved the way for the joint invasion and occupation of Poland in September 1939. With that agreement in place, Hitler believed the last major strategic obstacle had been removed. The question now was the West. Would Britain fight? Hitler's confidence did not come from ignorance. It came from interpretation. Britain had issued the guarantee to Poland in March, but a guarantee is only as strong as the will behind it. Hitler believed Britain's will was brittle. He believed Britain's empire made it cautious. He believed its society was not ready for another slaughter. And he believed Chamberlain personally would always search for a conference room exit. And there is evidence that Hitler and his circle openly expected Britain and France to back down. Contemporary summaries and historical reconstructions repeatedly note that Hitler assured his generals Britain and France would not fight over Poland, a belief built from Munich and the pattern of appeasement. The BBC's overview of the invasion of Poland states that when Hitler invaded, he was confident Britain and France would continue appeasement and broker a peace deal. Hitler also believed Britain's warning could be split from France's. France was politically divided, scarred by World War I, and strategically defensive behind the Maginot Line. Hitler's logic was that France would not act without Britain, and Britain would not act decisively at all. Here is what made that logic so dangerous. It wasn't entirely irrational, given what had happened up to March 1939. It was just wrong in September. Because Britain had changed its mind. It didn't change overnight, and it didn't change cleanly. But it changed enough. Once Britain guaranteed Poland, it created a trap for itself. If it did nothing when Poland was attacked, British deterrence would collapse, and Britain would be signaling to every other small state in Europe that British promises were empty. The guarantee was meant to deter Hitler, but it also committed Britain to proving it wasn't bluffing. And then, on August 25th, Britain and Poland formalized mutual assistance. The agreement exists as a published document in the British War Blue Book. Hitler saw this too. In fact, this is one of the moments where you can see Hitler hesitate. He had set the attack date for late August. Then, when news of the Anglo-Polish agreement arrived, he postponed the invasion. That postponement is important because it shows Hitler did not have absolute certainty that Britain would stand aside. He was calculating, testing, trying to avoid triggering a wider war if he could get Poland without it. But he also believed postponement would buy him something. Time to fracture the alliance, time to intimidate Warsaw, time to persuade Britain that Poland was being unreasonable, time to present himself as the patient negotiator and Poland as the stubborn provoker. That is why the final days of August are filled with strange diplomatic theater. Hitler demanded that Poland send a representative to Berlin with full powers within 24 hours. This was presented as an invitation to negotiate. In reality, it was a setup. No serious negotiation between states happens on a 24-hour ultimatum delivered under threat of invasion. Poland refused to be humiliated that way. Britain advised Poland not to fall into the trap. Britain knew by then that Hitler's demands were designed to be rejected, so he could claim he had tried everything. And then Hitler produced what became known as the 16 points, demands concerning Danzig and the corridor and plebiscites, delivered in a way that ensured they could not be properly discussed. The text of the German ultimatum and its main points have been preserved in historical document collections. All of it had the rhythm of negotiation and the structure of coercion, and behind it, the invasion plan was already built. Then came the night of August 31st and the staged incidents along the border, including the Gleiwitz false flag. The National World War II Museum notes that Hitler used the Gleiwitz incident as justification for the invasion by the morning of September 1, 1939. At 5:45 a.m. on September 1st, German forces attacked. Hitler announced to the Reichstag that Germany was returning the fire. Now the West had to decide whether its guarantee was real. Britain and France did not declare war immediately on September 1st. That delay is sometimes misunderstood. People imagine Britain hesitating again, bargaining again, searching for another Munich. There was hesitation, yes, but it wasn't the old kind. It was the hesitation of a government making sure it had exhausted the final procedural steps and aligned with France before stepping into a war it knew would be total. Britain delivered a final note, and it set a deadline. Unless Germany gave satisfactory assurances by 11 a.m. on September 3rd and withdrew, a state of war would exist. The text of that ultimatum is preserved in the Avalon Project documents. Germany did not comply. At 11:15 a.m., Chamberlain spoke to the British public from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. He told them no such undertaking had been received, and consequently, this country is at war with Germany. France issued its own ultimatum and declared war later that day. This was the moment Hitler had misread. He had misread it not because he lacked information, but because he believed the information would bend the way it always had. His entire method had worked by forcing other powers to choose between war now or worse, war later, and they had repeatedly chosen later. Hitler believed he could force the same choice again. Britain chose now. So why did Hitler start it anyway? Why invade Poland if war with Britain was even a possibility? Because from Hitler's perspective, the alternatives looked worse. He believed Germany needed to expand to survive and dominate. He believed delay strengthened his enemies. He believed Poland would not become a German satellite peacefully. He believed the Soviet deal had bought him a window. He believed France would not seriously attack in the West immediately. And he believed Britain's political structure, its memory of the last war, and its internal arguments would fracture under pressure. He also believed that once Poland collapsed quickly, Britain would face an ugly choice: fight a long war to reverse a fait accompli or accept the new reality. The speed of a Polish defeat was supposed to shock Britain into resignation. That was the plan. A short war in the East, then a diplomatic settlement in the West. What Hitler did not fully account for was the psychological shift that had occurred in Britain after Prague. Munich had not bought peace. It had bought humiliation. By September 1939, the idea of another settlement after another invasion was politically poisonous. If Chamberlain had tried to make peace while Poland was being destroyed, he might have lost power immediately. Britain's guarantee had created a domestic political trap as much as an international one. And Hitler also did not account for the moral clarity that comes when ambiguity evaporates. For years, Britain had argued over what Hitler wanted, what was reasonable, what could be traded. Poland removed the ambiguity. A sovereign country was invaded openly with mechanized force. The old arguments sounded hollow. Hitler had thought Britain would bargain over Poland the way it had bargained over Czechoslovakia. But Britain had been able to bargain over Czechoslovakia because it had not guaranteed it, because it could tell itself it was avoiding war, because it could pretend the crisis was local. Poland was different. Britain had made a promise in public, and promises in public have a strange property. They stop being about the other country and start being about you. Hitler, of course, had his own miscalculations layered on top of that. He believed Britain was weak, but he also believed Britain was rational in the sense that it would accept losses rather than gamble the empire. In his mind, Britain should have been willing to let Germany dominate Eastern Europe in exchange for security in the West and protection of the empire. He thought he could offer something like that. The Imperial War Museums describes Hitler offering to guarantee the safety of Britain's empire while insisting the Poland problem had to be solved. That's how Hitler saw the world, as a bargaining table of empires, not a system of collective security and international law. He believed Britain would recognize that logic if it were pressured hard enough. But Britain saw a different threat. If Germany dominated the continent, Britain would be strategically strangled sooner or later. Britain did not go to war because it loved Poland more than peace. It went to war because it believed a German-dominated Europe would eventually force Britain into an even worse war, on worse terms. That is why the guarantee existed in the first place. So when people ask, why did Hitler start World War II with Poland? The answer is not because of Danzig, and it is not because of Versailles. Those are surfaces. He started it because he wanted to destroy Poland as an obstacle to eastward expansion, and because he believed he could do it quickly enough to keep Britain from turning a Polish war into a European war. And when people ask, why did he think Britain wouldn't fight back? The answer is, because Britain had trained him to think so, and because Hitler and his circle filtered every signal through a worldview that treated democratic restraint as weakness and diplomatic caution as cowardice. Now here's the part that makes this story so dark. Hitler didn't just miscalculate Britain. He also calculated that even if Britain declared war, it might not be able to do much immediately. And in September 1939, that calculation looked plausible. Britain's army was not ready for continental warfare on the scale that would come. France's doctrine was defensive. The first months of the war would later be called the phony war, not because nothing happened, but because the apocalyptic scale people feared did not arrive immediately in the West. That delay reinforced Hitler's belief that the declaration itself might still be hollow. But declarations have consequences, even when armies are not yet moving. They change economies, alliances, and time. Hitler had gambled that Britain would not fight. Britain fought. And the moment Britain fought, Hitler's world became a long war of resources, production, coalition building, and eventual attrition, exactly the kind of war Germany was least suited to win against a global coalition. That is the irony. Hitler started the war thinking he was avoiding the one war Germany could not win. He also started it because he could not stop. By late 1939, Hitler's regime had built itself around momentum. It needed victories to legitimize itself, loot to sustain its economy, and expansion to feed its military-industrial machine. Poland was not just a target, it was fuel. Delay would mean rethinking the entire trajectory, and Hitler was not a man who rethought trajectories. He doubled down, and that is why the final days feel so frantic when you read them as a sequence. Ultimatums, delays, offers, demands, false flags, speeches, deadlines. The machinery was already in motion. The propaganda was already printed. The troops were already positioned. The Soviet deal had already been signed. The calendar had already been marked. Britain's guarantee was the last possible break. Hitler tested it and found it real. But by then, he had already decided that the cost of backing down, politically, strategically, ideologically, was greater than the cost of war. Britain chose war because it believed the future would be worse without it. Hitler chose war because he believed the future would be impossible without conquest. Those two futures collided in Poland. And if you want to understand how a European crisis turned into a world war, the answer is not that a single invasion started it. It's that the invasion forced Britain to prove its promise, forced France to follow, and forced Hitler into a war he had tried to structure as short, limited, and controlled. He thought Britain wouldn't fight back. He was wrong.